The AA Grapevine magazine had been started for Hitler's war so AA soldiers could stay sober overseas. And 2 months after the Grapevine landed on the Normandy beaches, Hitler began taking cocaine twice a day in August of 1944 on his doctor's recommendation. And Hitler said that it made him think more clearly, and within a year he would be dead. The first issue of the Grapevine was 8 pages long and was published in June of 1944, and the Grapevine started by, quote, 6 ink-stained wretches, close quote, was specifically intended to reach the people in the military, and Bill W. would write more than 100 articles for them. Due to enormous anti-aircraft fire on the 6th of June in 1944, most of the C-47s bringing the paratroopers to Normandy had taken diversionary action, so the Americans had been spread out far afield from their drop zones, and it had seemed a bad thing at the time, but because the drops were so scattered, the American paratroopers had survived the Germans who'd been waiting for them. When the Vikings had landed on the beaches of Normandy in the year 9/11, it had been named after them as Northmandy, and the name Brittany came from the French Bretagne, or the land stolen by the English, although the French at first called it Armorica from a Celtic word meaning the land by the sea. The Higgins boats, designed in New Orleans for the Normandy landing, held 36 men each and could switch from forward to reverse at full power, and the Utah-bound Higgins boats carrying the Americans had left from Plymouth Harbor. When our forces were moved to the takeoff area on May 30, 1944, Leigh Mallory personally called on General Eisenhower to protest the use of the U.S. airborne forces using the term, quote, the futile slaughter of 2 fine divisions, close quote. In Eisenhower's book Crusade in Europe, he states, Leigh Mallory believed that the combination of unsuitable landing grounds and the anticipated resistance was too great a hazard to overcome, close quote. Leigh Mallory did not think that this was present in the British area, but he estimated that among the American outfits we would suffer some 70% losses in glider strength and 50% in parachute strength, even before the airborne troops could land. Even today, more than 30 years later, I feel a fury rise in me when I realize that Leigh Mallory was going to have us left behind, and that all our American airlift would have been given to the British. On to Berlin, page 102 and 3. Instead of being stopped at the Normandy beaches, Hitler's plan had been to let the Americans march into Paris, then annihilate them with von Rundstedt's army waiting there in ambush. But Rommel had told von Rundstedt that air attacks could stop German ground forces, and Rommel described to him what had happened in North Africa, and von Rundstedt believed Rommel's insistence that the Americans needed to be stopped on the Normandy beaches. However, Hitler held firm about the Paris plan and was not worried about what was called air superiority, because he had all the targets worked out with the British, and at the time the Americans were subordinate to British Bomber Command. The defenses on the Normandy beaches had been just for show, von Rundstedt secretly told Rommel, and the Atlantic Wall defenses were intended only for propaganda purposes, in order to get the Americans to invade so they could be taken out as soon as they had almost reached Paris. On the other hand, Hitler's West Wall had been the greatest construction project in history, and was meant to keep out the enemies of Germany, specifically the British. And they'd used 1 million tons of steel and 1 million tons of timber, and 3 million rolls of barbed wire and 5 million cubic yards of concrete. And in comparison, the Hoover Dam used 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, a little over half that much. Rommel's efforts to build adequate defenses for the Atlantic Wall had met steadfast opposition from Berlin, and Rommel had no authority to fortify the Normandy beaches until January of 1944, but in that short time, Rommel had managed to install millions of mines and scores of tank traps, including Rommel's asparagus, and he had to promise Hitler that the work would be completed by the 1st of May, but by D-Day on the 6th of June, Rommel told Hitler that the defenses were only 20% complete. The invasion date for the 1st of May had been agreed to at the Quebec meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt on the 17th of August in 1943, and the main issue at the Quebec meeting had been Churchill wanting the Americans to share with the British what they knew about an atomic bomb. Thereafter, Churchill would pursue this matter vigorously, and he sent 4 agents to the Pentagon the following month, as well as planting British agents within the Manhattan Project. When the Americans were on the way to France after D-Day, the Germans had been given enough advance warning to flood the Cotentin Peninsula days ahead of time, so deeply that in many places the American paratroopers simply drowned upon landing. And Hitler had sent 2 extra divisions in May of 1944 to the peninsula sector facing the Americans, claiming to have, quote, fished from the Channel waters, close quote, a copy of the Americans' field orders. Hitler's Paris plan had allowed for a considerable British presence just north of where Monty would remain for the duration of the Battle of Normandy, while the Americans would be landed to the south and then told to march on Paris. Hitler moved the 1st SS Panzer Division to Paris, but Rommel convinced von Rundstedt to prepare to move away from Paris towards the Normandy beaches, although Schweppenberg and Guderian were firmly against that move because it directly disobeyed Hitler's orders. The British were pretending that the landing would be at Calais, even though no one believed it anywhere, but that deception, called Operation Fortitude, was used as the excuse for the bulk of the German army to be stationed north of Caen, right next to Monty. And after the Americans would be crushed outside Paris, the British would have no choice but to make peace with Hitler. On D-Day, the air forces under British command had dropped their 13,000 pounds of bombs 30 miles well inland where the Germans were not, instead of onto the Omaha beach defenses in front of the Americans, and the British had known that 3 German divisions had moved up right behind Omaha Beach, and reports pinpointing the Germans' new location were sent to Ike first thing in the morning on D-Day, but they did not reach Ike until later, due to a British clampdown on radio communications in the name of security. Hitler gave his commanders in France a stand-down order on D-Day, allowing the Americans to come on shore so they could march towards Paris. But Rommel was thwarting this stand-down order and causing Hitler no end of grief. The British were supposed to hold a quote-unquote firm bastion up north, and Hitler had specifically declined von Rundstedt's request to move from Paris toward the Normandy beaches, and when finally given permission to prepare to advance, von Rundstedt went farther than Hitler had agreed and got attacked by Allied air power. When Rommel was recalled to Berlin on the 17th of June, he was chastised for failing to obey Hitler's direct orders, and Rommel went back to Normandy and continued to fight on his own initiative. And on the 17th of July, as Rommel was leaving von Rundstedt's headquarters in an open touring car, he was strafed by a lone Spitfire and sent to the hospital with 3 head fractures, and the doctors reported that he would surely die. 3 days later, Stauffenberg and his friends tried to kill Hitler in Operation Valkyrie, and Rommel's involvement would never be proven, as all the records involved were quickly burned. Monty's Operation Goodwood had been named after the Duke of Richmond's estate, and the Duke was an aircraft designer and a pilot during Hitler's war, and Goodwood ended with the failure of Stauffenberg's 20th of July plot, and the Urantia book described the devil's error as, quote, fallacies of personal liberty and fictions of self-determination, close quote. For Heidegger, a conscience presupposes learning, with knowing, and the British lost 500 tanks during Goodwood, 1/3 of all they had, along with 4,000 men, and surrender had been in the air. The 20th of July had been the day that the Pope signed the pact with Hitler in 1935, and that meant a lot to the conspirators who were for the most part Catholics. And the Americans knew who was behind the Stauffenberg plot on the 20th of July because some of them had planned to negotiate with the Americans in the surrender and not deal with the British. And they had already contacted Allen Dulles about their plan and told Dulles that Rommel was on their side, but that had only been conjecture on their part because they were merely counting on Rommel taking orders from them after Hitler was blown up by Stauffenberg's bomb. The plot had been that after they killed Hitler, the conspirators would save Germany by taking charge of the army, directing all German troops to stand down, and then they would call Stalin with the good news that the war was over. According to Rommel's wife, Rommel thought that murdering Hitler would cause civil war in Germany, so Rommel had wanted Hitler put on trial instead of killing him, and for that Rommel needed to gather enough evidence of Hitler's perfidy negotiating with the British before arresting him. Rommel had wanted the arrest to take place when Hitler was visiting Margival in France on the 17th of June. But Rommel did not think he had enough evidence yet, and he had been unable to convince half of Hitler's generals that the plan would work. Rommel had swayed von Rundstedt and many others, but because Rommel was not from that class of nobility as the other generals, many of them looked down on him and had been plotting their own separate peace with the British nobles, with whom they were more comfortable dealing than with Rommel. On the 15th of July, Rommel wrote a letter to Hitler urging peace with the Americans, but the letter was delayed in France by the German generals loyal to Rommel, ostensibly in the name of the extreme secrecy being observed in preparation for Operation Valkyrie, and they'd wanted to protect Rommel from being mixed up in something he knew nothing about. The letter would not have done any good, even if it had reached Hitler's desk, because Churchill had already shown proof to Hitler that Rommel was a traitor. Thousands were arrested and tortured after the 20th of July bomb plot failed, including Count York. And Rommel's name was mentioned often in the fevered interrogations, and he'd been included on many lists as being a potential future president of Germany. While Rommel had miraculously survived the strafing on the 17th of July, he would be given the opportunity to kill himself on the 14th of October to save his family and friends from Hitler's revenge. And Rommel was promised a state funeral with full military honors, along with an announcement that he had succumbed to his injuries due to the strafing of his staff car in Normandy on the 17th of July, which was somewhere near the truth, and so Rommel died a hero's death with full honors due his service to the fatherland. When he'd been in command in North Africa, Rommel had not allowed the cleansing of Jews, and he had refused to obey Hitler's orders to execute Jewish POWs. And he'd protested to Hitler at Margival about the SS wanting to use the army to kill Jews in France. Rommel had also asked permission from Hitler to punish the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich for having massacred civilians at Oradour-sur-Glane. And Rommel had told Hitler not to use Jewish slave labor to build the Atlantic Wall, but recommended that they hire Frenchmen and pay them good wages. But that did not happen. And had the Germans taken over Egypt and the Holy Land, the fate of the Jews there would have been sealed, unless Rommel had been in command. Hitler had survived an assassination attempt on the 13th of March in 1943, and the next month the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on the 19th of April, and a few weeks later the Germans in North Africa surrendered to the British on the 12th of May, 4 days before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising ended on the 16th of May. Mussolini was finished 2 months later on the 25th of July in 1943, and 6 weeks after that, the Germans came into Italy on the 8th of September, and 1 year later, the first V-2 rockets were fired on London, 7 days after the Americans survived Monty's 90-day plan in the Normandy theater, winning command over their own American armies so they could march to Paris unmolested. Churchill had flown to Paris on the 16th of May in 1940, the week the Germans marched into France, and Churchill flew over again on the 22nd, and Bilat died the next day in the car crash on the 23rd, and Bilat had been the only Frenchman who'd been told the British plan. The following day, on the 24th, Hitler flew to Charleville, just a few miles downstream from Sedan, and Hitler's first stop in Paris would be to visit the Paris Opera House. During the first week of February, in 1945, at the Yalta Conference in the Crimea, when FDR sided heavily with Stalin, the British bombed Dresden 3 days later, and despite being bombed in air raids since 1942, the industrial heartland of Germany, called the Ruhr, continued to produce war material for the German army right up until the last days of the war. After each raid, it had cleared the rubble, patched the damage, and gone back into production. Although air eventually hurt the Ruhr, it had failed to destroy it. Without the Ruhr, Germany would be unable to support its armies in the field. Although a road running east from Cologne offered the shortest route, we would prefer to make Frankfurt the main U.S. effort and complete our encirclement when the Ruhr pocket was closed around more than 300,000 troops of Model's army group. Bradley, page 413-15. Model was not the only senior soldier sticking his head in the sand that day. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery still believed that he, his friends in the British Army, and Churchill could change Eisenhower's mind and reverse the minor flank role that apparently would soon be allotted to his Second British Army. Churchill was indeed trying. That Saturday, 31 March 1945, he wrote to Eisenhower to restate his own preferred course of action. I do not consider myself that Berlin has yet lost its military and certainly not its political significance. The fall of Berlin would have a profound psychological effect on German resistance in every part of the Reich. While Berlin holds out, great masses of Germans will feel it their duty to go down fighting. Therefore, I should greatly prefer persistence in the plan on which we crossed the Rhine, namely that the 9th U.S. Army should march with the 21st Army Group to the Elbe and beyond Berlin. This would not be in any way inconsistent with the great central thrust which you are now so rightly developing as the result of the brilliant operations of your armies south of the Ruhr. It only shifts the weight of one army to the northern flank, and this avoids the relegation of His Majesty's forces to an unexpected restricted sphere. But Brooke, the dour Ulsterman, did not feel that Churchill's flowery compliments would work. Despite all their efforts, the British failed to make Eisenhower change his mind. The die was cast. Montgomery was out of the running, and Bradley was in sole charge now. A few days later, the 9th Army would come under Bradley's command, and he would become the first American general ever to command 4 U.S. armies in the field, just under 1.5 million U.S. soldiers. Bradley's wishes were now paramount. How else can one explain what happened as dusk fell on this Saturday? Collins was worried. They were thinly spread out, boxing in a whole German army group. Besides, there was an escape route open to the Germans west of Paderborn, on the north face of the Ruhr. This was on the 9th Army's front, quote, which as far as I then knew was still under Montgomery's control, close quote, Collins recalled long after the war. So he now took a step which was eloquent testimony to the toughness of the SS resistance south of Paderborn, and also to the fact that he realized Montgomery's power was on the wane. As he later admitted to himself, he now, quote, went outside normal command channels, close quote, just as Eisenhower had caused a rumpus in the British camp on 28 March by addressing Stalin, the head of another state, without reference to his political masters in Washington. Collins now approached the head of another army, the U.S. 9th, without approaching Montgomery through channels first. Collins and General William Simpson, the head of the U.S. 9th Army, knew each other well, of course. Simpson agreed to do what Lightning Joe requested. He'd switch the 2nd Armor from the Beckham area and direct it to Lippstadt. And that was that. Collins had made an unprecedented move, parenthesis, channels of communication were as strict in the American Army as they were in the British, close parenthesis, and now Simpson did something equally significant. He ordered General White, the commander of the 2nd Armored Division, to attack towards Lippstadt without consulting Monty. As Churchill was to comment ruefully when he realized that the future in Germany lay now in American hands, quote, there is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them, close quote. The Battle of the Ruhr Pocket, April 8, 1945, by Leo Kessler, Chelsea, Michigan, Scarborough House Publishers, 1989, page 99 to 102. And with that, the V-2 rockets immediately stopped falling on London. Paderborn was where the Pope had fled in 799 A.D. to find safe refuge with Charlemagne's army, and the Pope had been attacked on the 25th of April, but was saved by Charlemagne and stayed with him in Paderborn for 90 days, and after saving the Pope and restoring him to his proper place in Rome, Charlemagne had come back to also save England. Paderborn had been where the German pharmacist Friedrich Wilhelm Adams Serturner first distilled morphine from opium in 1804, and Serturner then moved to Hamelin in 1822, where he spent the next 2 decades experimenting with his morphine, and Hamelin was where the story about the Pied Piper had come from. The Pied Piper was hired to lure rats away from town with his magic pipe. Just after the French in Italy had murdered the Bavarian Conradin in 1268, handing the Holy Roman Empire to the Habsburg Rudolph I from Switzerland, and the French had been able to ambush Conradin because he'd decided to hook up with the Muslims in Lucera, a city 100 miles away from Rome, and these Muslims had been sent to Lucera 40 years earlier after being expelled from Sicily. In Lucera, 20,000 of them comprised the last Islamic presence in Italy, and Conrad thought he could use them to fight against the French. But he wasn't even halfway to Lucera when the French waylaid Conradin to put a stop to what had seemed like a good idea at the time, and the Moslems in Lucera would be completely crushed 17 years after the Pied Piper showed up in Hamelin in 1284, and those who survived fled to Albania. With the expulsion of Germans from Italy with the death of Conradin, the opium trade shifted towards the victorious French, and when the townsfolk in Hamelin refused to pay the Pied Piper, he used his magic pipe to lure away their children. Hamelin was 35 miles closer to Berlin than Paderborn, and Lippstadt was 17 miles away from Paderborn, and aerial bombing would destroy 85% of Paderborn after Monty was marginalized away from the Americans' conclusion to Hitler's war. Now the great race was on. It was Sunday, 1 April, 1945, April Fool's Day. Early this morning, General Heinz, commander of the Hells on Wheels, not Hell on Wheels, Hells on Wheels, ordered his Combat Command B to start rolling towards Lippstadt to link up with the First Army. The Americans' progress was slow, however, hampered by thousands of refugees streaming southwest and by smaller groups of sullen men in field gray looking for someone to surrender to. Collins was desperate to achieve the link-up this Sunday to get on with the business of winning the war without interference from the top brass. Now it was dawn. The morning was bright and warm. The tanks and half-tracks rattled up the dead straight roads, past orchards that were full of peach and cherry trees heavy with premature blossom, a bright pink and white, through little villages that had been untouched by the war, past churches where the bells were pealing, calling the faithful Catholics to Mass. It was Easter, after all. The Battle of the Ruhr Pocket, page 106 and 7. When Zhukov had launched his offensive against the Germans and reached the outskirts of Warsaw on the 1st of September in 1944, the Poles had revolted against the Germans, thinking that the Allies would come to their aid, but the Allies had been busy elsewhere, and because the Russian advance towards Germany stopped there to await the outcome of British operations in the Normandy theatre, having been informed in fine detail by Kim Philby about Operation Queen, by the time Zhukov entered Warsaw, the Nazis had destroyed the city block by block. The British wanted to fly humanitarian aid into Warsaw, but the Russians knew better than to let that happen. And Stalin told the British to step up their part of Hitler's war instead, since it had been Britain's pact with Poland that had started this whole bloody mess in the first place, and Stalin told the Brits that from then on they should stay the hell out of Poland.